Hi folks, and welcome back to another edition of Zog Science. We're going to be finishing up our last section of Chapter 1 and take a look at science as a process. So our concept here is that scientists form and test hypotheses, and that's what we're going to be doing a lot in this class. We're going to be performing a lot of experiments, trying to figure things out, and you're going to be conducting your own experiments, so we want to make sure we've got a good foundation of that. So science is derived from Latin meaning to know, and so the scientific process is basically a way of trying to figure out things or to know things. And the general formula for how that works is that we're going to make some observations, we're then going to form some sort of hypothesis, and then we're going to try to test that hypothesis. But the most important thing is that it begins with some observations, right? We're going to observe living things and try to answer some questions about our observations. A key part of that is about reading and understanding past studies so you can try to build upon what is already known. When we record our observations, that is called data, and we can either have data beforehand or we can have data after or during our experiment. There are two different types of data. There is qualitative data, which is where we have descriptions of things, we describe something, or we can have quantitative data. Quantitative data is where we have actual measurements that we can then organize usually into some sort of table or graph. Now, when we have these observations, we then want to make some sort of hypothesis. And our hypothesis is a rational kind of guess as to what we think is going on based on our observations, right? And so then what we're going to do is we're going to test that explanation, right? And a scientific hypothesis is going to lead to predictions that we can test. So we come up with this hypothesis, and it's going to give us things that we should predict. If our hypothesis is true, then we would expect certain outcomes. And so then what we can do is we can test to see, do we get those outcomes, right? So an experiment is that test where we try to control things in order to determine whether or not our question is, or our hypothesis is correct or not. So for example, let's say that your desk lamp doesn't work, right? The question is then, well, why doesn't it work? So you could actually have multiple hypotheses that could basically answer this question. Either the bulb is burned out, or something in the actual lamp itself is broken, or there could be other ones, right? Maybe the outlet isn't functioning, right? There's lots and lots of different hypotheses, right? But our two example ones, both of them are testable. We can either try to replace the lamp, or we can try to replace the bulb, right? Now, the thing is that a hypothesis cannot actually be necessarily conclusively proven because there's too many alternatives, right? There may be another alternative that may be true. However, our hypothesis can gain in credibility, and we can essentially say that they are true by surviving multiple attempts at determining whether or not they are right or wrong. Right? So we perform multiple tests, and then we are able to say, okay, we're pretty confident that this hypothesis is correct. A hypothesis, when we write hypotheses, they must be testable and they must be falsifiable. So unfortunately, we can't do hypotheses to test supernatural explanations because we can't actually test those, right? And so therefore, that's kind of outside of the realm of science. Now, you've probably learned about the scientific method, right? It's got a certain number of steps. And the reality is that very few scientific studies actually rigidly adhere to that sequence of steps, right? It's really much more of a fluid process where we are making observations, asking questions, trying to come up with an explanation, and then testing an explanation, and then kind of repeating that process. Now, when we do our experiment, when we try to test our hypothesis, we want to make sure that we are running a nice controlled experiment, right? And a controlled experiment is one where we compare an experimental group with a control group, and that's going to help us to be able to know whether or not our experiment is actually testing what we want it to. So the thing that we are manipulating, or you are manipulating as the researcher, right, is called the independent variable. Okay, and the effect of the manipulated variable factor, what you are measuring, that's called the dependent variable. And so what we want to do as researchers is that the things that are not those two variables, we want to try to control those things. We want to try to know that we are only seeing an effect on the dependent variable from the independent variable. And so what we'll do is we'll run control groups where we will try to figure out what is the effect of these other variables on the dependent variable, and then we'll be able to say what is actually left over, what is just the independent variable. Now, let's say that we've got a bunch of data, we've tested our hypotheses, right? We can then come up with what a theory is, right? And a theory is broader in scope than just a specific hypothesis, right? It's going to cover more ground, and it's going to be general enough to where it can lead to new testable hypotheses, where we can test lots of different things in order to figure out whether or not this theory is true, or maybe get at kind of the nuance of the theory, right? And a theory is supported by a large body of evidence, right? It's maybe multiple hypotheses across kind of a wide variety of scopes, as opposed to just testing one question like a single hypothesis is going to do. So science is also a very collaborative social process, right? Most scientists don't just work by themselves. They are going to work in teams. They're going to work together. And scientists are always building on the knowledge of prior generations, right? Scientists that came before them, they studied other things. So that's what we're going to be doing in this class. You're going to work together in teams. You're going to try to build your knowledge base off of what other people have learned. So when you do some sort of experiment, you always want to try to do some background research in order to learn what do we already know, and then how can we take that a step further, right? In the real world, when scientists do experiments, they check each other. So they will repeat experiments in order to collaborate and see whether or not others' work is correct or if it needs to be tweaked somehow. Thanks for watching. That's the end of chapter 1, and I'll hope to see you next time.